For this chapter, we're going to be talking about plate tectonics, how the surface of the Earth very slowly moves around over time. We'll talk about the different types of plate boundaries and how the plates move in relation to each other, and the different types of geologic features we see around each type of plate boundary. But for this video, we're just going to focus on how we figured out plate tectonics even existed. So before the 1960s, most scientists believed that the oceans and the continents were fixed in place over time. They thought that they were completely stationary and they could not move. But in the 1960s, we discovered plate tectonics, that instead of everything being in one fixed location, we see that they're slowly moving around over millions of years. This led way to a total scientific revolution and made us completely rethink about how we think about our planet. But with this, we learned that with tectonic processes, the way that the plates are moving and interacting with one another, it's actually deforming the crust of our planet and creating major features, things like mountains on our continents and deep sea trenches in our oceans. So again, we didn't know about plate tectonics until the 1960s. Before that, we had kind of primitive ways of thinking about the surface of our planet. In the 1960s, the first thoughts started to come around about the shapes of the continents, when some people realized that if we could cut out South America and Africa, their shapes fit together pretty well, which you can see in the bottom image. But it wasn't until 1915 that anyone really thought about this anymore. And now we see this guy named Alfred Wegener coming around with his idea or his hypothesis of continental drift. With this, he thought that hundreds of millions of years ago, there was a supercontinent called Pangaea. And today we have 7 continents. But he thought that during this period of time, that Pangaea had all 7 land masses combined into one supercontinent. But he also thought that this supercontinent Pangaea started to break apart about 200 million years ago, and that the different land masses very slowly drifted apart over those 200 million years into their current geographic locations. The problem is that Alfred Wegener is not a geologist. So geologists, the scientists that study the Earth, didn't take him very seriously at first. So Wegener came up with 5 different pieces of scientific evidence that supported his hypothesis of continental drift. And his first piece of evidence was that the coastlines on most of our continents seem to fit together or match, like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. But because Alfred Wegener was not a geologist, his opponents argued that over millions of years that waves from our oceans and the beaches are going to change our shorelines. It's going to change their shapes. But if we look at the actual continental shelf of a continent, not just the amount of land above the water, but if we could go off maybe 100 miles off the coast where it's still continental rock but underwater, that's an even better shape of the boundaries between these 2 continents, which we can see in this image by the light blue shaded areas. Wegener's second piece of scientific evidence is that he found multiple types of fossils that matched across continents. So matching fossils across massive oceans. One of the fossils he found was called a Mesosaurus, which you can see down here in A on the image. And this is a freshwater reptile. But because it's a freshwater reptile, it cannot survive or swim inside of ocean water. Yet its fossils are found in both South America and in Africa. There has to be a way that it could get between these 2 continents without being in salt water. But in addition to this reptile, Wegener also found a seed fern called Glostosterus, and he found this fossil in Africa, Australia, India, South America, and Antarctica. So basically every single continent. And this made even less sense, because at least with that Mesosaurus, it has the ability to swim from one continent to another. But with a fern, ferns can't get up and move. All that can happen is that they release their spores into the air, and the air can transport it. But wind is not going to be able to transport those fern spores over entire oceans. So in order to find fossils of both plants and animals on different continents, paleontologists agreed. It's really weird. And the only thing they could think of that would allow this to happen would be some kind of land bridge between the continents that would allow animals to move back and forth. But remember, Wegener was not a geologist, so his opponents were really against him. They would do whatever they possibly could to disprove him. So even though he had pretty good evidence saying, hey, plants and animals can't just cross the entire Atlantic Ocean, his opponents came up with evidence against him. And they said that, yes, there could have been land bridges allowing these animals to move from one continent to another. We now know that humans used the land bridge to get from Alaska to Europe and vice versa. But some of the other evidence that his opponents used to kind of disprove him was thinking that these animals could simply raft from one continent to another. And I don't know about you, but if I was holding on to a log, I don't think I'm going to make the journey from one continent to another. But they also came up with this idea that there could have been island stepping stones, these small islands dotting the way between these continents, again over massive oceans, so that animals could very quickly get from one island to the next. And for me, this just doesn't sound very possible. Maybe between two continents, but remember that fern was found on all of our continents. But Wegener had a third type of evidence that he used against them. And this was the types of rocks that were found on different continents. Remember how we can have igneous rocks that are formed by cooling off magma deep inside of the earth? Well, if that giant magma chamber is underneath two continents that eventually separate, we're going to find rocks of a similar type and age underneath two continents. And this is the third type of evidence that Wegener found. He found that the rock types do match up between our continents. But the fourth type was again looking at the rocks, but instead of looking at whether they were igneous, metamorphic, or sedimentary, he looked for mountain ranges. And he found that between most of our continents, especially the ones that looked like their pieces would fit together, that there are mountain ranges between these continents where they would fit. A good example is the Appalachian Mountains and a mountain range along Africa. If you could move North America and Africa together so that they fit, that mountain range lines up nearly perfectly between them. So now we have 4 pieces of evidence that Wegener had. He had the shapes of the continents, the fossil evidence, now the rock types against continents, and mountain ranges between continents. And his final piece of evidence was evidence of glaciers in places that are now really warm tropical areas. So he found evidence of glaciers in places like South Africa and India. Today, these places are normally about 90 degrees on average, so there's no way that they could support glaciers. But Wegener said if his supercontinent of Pangaea actually existed, that all of these locations would actually be near the South Pole when it was hundreds of millions of years ago, which would allow glaciers to not only exist, but leave evidence of the fact that they were there for long periods of time. So Wegener had all of this evidence to support his hypothesis of continental drift. But so far, we've called it a hypothesis. It's not yet a theory because Wegener couldn't come up with a reason why the continents would drift around over time. He had solid evidence that they did, but because he couldn't come up with a mechanism, a reason why and how the continents moved, he was completely disregarded. So in order to come up with some way of why and how the continents moved, he came up with this idea that tidal forces moved continents. So tidal forces are just waves coming up and hitting against the continents at the beach. You've likely been to a beach at some point. Maybe you've been knocked over by the waves. But how likely do you think it is that an entire continent, like North America, is going to be moved around by ocean waves over time? It didn't make any sense. So this was basically the end of it for a few more decades. Wegener had really good evidence that continents seemed to move around over millions of years. But even though he had this evidence, he couldn't come up with a reason why or how they moved around, so he was disregarded. It kind of fell off until the 1960s.